Bible class, Sunday school in July.
Oh.
Because Julia's gone, I'm
yeah.
gone, and Michaela's gone.
Okay, so we're going to get started this morning. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, welcome. Sorry that we didn't meet last week. I know that it's hard when the schedule gets changed, but we're back to our pattern today. However, next Sunday, we will not be having our 8 o'clock, we won't be having our recording. So Robert Pick will be here, and he'll be teaching 11 o'clock hour, but there won't be an 8 o'clock class. And then after that, we're pretty steady till cornfields, whenever that is. I'm taking one step at a time these days. So, but we are in Ezekiel, and I want to remind you of what we did last time in Ezekiel. We were in Ezekiel 21, and there were two parts there in 20 to 21, that section. That was the 20, between chapter 20 to 23 was the third vision. And if you remember, part of what it did was it talked about the things that were going to happen that were against the children, the people, the children of Israel, and the things that were against the temple. God was offended at what the elders were doing, like the leadership and the people there, and he was also offended in the temple. And then he was offended by the people themselves, and we kind of read through that section. And if you remember, we talked about how the Babylonians were being used as God's sword. They were only allowed to do what they did because God allowed them to do it. And remember that God made it clear that when he was done using his sword, he will get rid of his sword. He was not loyal to Babylonia. He didn't like them. He didn't like Assyria. But he used those surrounding enemies to discipline his own people. And he made sure that that was real clear in what we read, who was doing this. He kept saying, I am doing this, not somebody else. So now we're going to be in Ezekiel chapter 24. So we're on the fourth vision. The first vision was in Ezekiel 1. The second vision was in Ezekiel 8 through 19. And the third vision is in chapters 20 to 23. And now we're on the fourth vision. This fourth vision has an interesting piece that ties to something we talked about when we did Revelation. And so I want to make sure we understand what this fourth vision is about. It starts in Ezekiel 24, chapter 1. So Ezekiel 24, chapter 1. So it says, in the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th day, the word of the Lord came to me. Okay, so if you're making notes, that's January 15th, 588 BC, in case that's something you want to know about. But we have a very interesting piece of information in 2 Kings. So if you want to hold on to that or just listen, we're going to go to 2 Kings chapter 24. Isn't it interesting that it's both in chapter 24? 2 Kings chapter 24. I marked this and now I don't remember how I marked it. So I could turn quickly. 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 1. During Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land, and Joachim became the vassal for 3 years. When we look back at Ezekiel 24:1, we have January 15th, 588, and in 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 1, these events that occur during Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land. That is also January 15th, 588. So we're seeing the same time. Now, Kings is the book of history, right? It's the historical events. So what happened first? The record of the history in Kings or the prophecy of what was going to happen in Ezekiel? Sometimes we get confused, Marta. You know why? Because Ezekiel's back over here, like later. But actually, the record of what happened in Kings is what actually did happen. What we see in Ezekiel is the prophecy of what's going to happen. And we miss all this, like as we're going through Ezekiel, we kind of miss it because we keep going back and say, oh yeah, and then they did this and this. Oh yeah, just like in history we see. Well, Ezekiel is telling about it before it happened. And that's what is so remarkable. And that's why people oohed and awed that Ezekiel had had these visions and that these things came to pass. And in 2 Kings, we see the record of it.
Prophecy is always before something happens, isn't it? Or is it
Sometimes, not always, sometimes prophets are revealing to like kings and rulers what the problem is. They're speaking on behalf of God. And it could be at a current time, something that's going on. So we're focusing on these prophetic things that happen in the future.
So maybe we think of prophecy as we're defining it wrong, because the prophets were just saying what God told them to say.
And what were the priests?
They carried out the rites in the temples.
Yes,
Yeah.
they spoke from the people to God.
Right.
They gave the prayers, they did the things to God from the people.
Atonement, yeah.
And the prophets spoke on behalf of God to the people. Now, why did they need that? Why didn't they just get out their Bibles and read it for themselves?
Yeah, there was no Bible.
Oral.
Right. This
There was
is
some writing.
yeah. There was some writings, and they began to make writings. But the other thing is, who has my one? Someone has my timeline. Did someone take my timeline? Maybe it's in the other class. Remember, I was just reading in Genesis this last week. We need to remember that at the time that some of the things these things were happening, the people were alive for whom those events happened. In the early history of what happened to the different people groups in the world, a lot of those same people were alive when those events were recorded and being repeated. That's one of the ways we know that we have an accurate recording of so far back in time. Now in this time, we're reading about the prophets, and we're focusing on prophecy. And if we would be focusing on when we focus on prophecy, it would be technically everything God has to say to us, because that's the way they thought of it. But we're kind of focusing on the tie into the future events that we read in Revelation. And today we're going to hit a big one that is kind of interesting to see. Yes, Fern?
I have a stupid question.
I may not be able to answer.
I don't mind. I don't mind. But was Moses sat in the tent of meeting and wrote down the Pentateuch? If, or at least Moses did the first 5 books. Was there any writings before that?
They had an oral history. Their tradition was an oral history. They told the stories, and they sang the stories. And I believe there were some writings. Do you know about any writings before that?
They're saying that writing pretty much came about
That time.
About that time when they were coming out of Egypt.
Okay.
And it's close to the ancient, not the hieroglyphs, but the ancient Egyptian writing. I'll direct you to some Ron Wyatt and some other people that have studied them coming out of Egypt.
The Hebrew language is very much like we think of Chinese or Japanese writing, in that it's more pictographic.
Yeah,
And so that ties then to the early form of cuneiform tablets and stuff, things like that.
In this book, it talks about like on the real Mount Sinai. There's the cattle. That's real interesting. They're on the rocks, and then there's I can't remember what paleo writing it is, but there's a sandal print and a letter that meant wherever your sandals hit, this land is yours. And that is one of the first on the rocks lettering that there is for Paleo Hebrew.
Okay, so let's go. I'm going to read a little bit out of 2 Kings chapter 24. I'm going to read verses 1 through 5, and then we're going to go back to Ezekiel. So 2 Kings 24, 1 through 5. During Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. But then he changed his mind and rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. Oh, wasn't that a smart move? The Lord sent Babylonian, Armenian, Moabite, and Ammonite raiders against him. Now notice those names. Babylonian, Aramean, Moabite, and Ammonite raiders. That's all the neighbors around, okay? He sent them to destroy Judah. Now, why is it being recorded here in 2 Kings that he sent them? keep that in mind. Judah, in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by his servants, the prophets. Who? Ezekiel. They could have said Ezekiel was one of them that said this would happen. Surely these things happened to Judah according to whose command? God's command, in order to remove them from his presence because of the sins of Manasseh and all he had done, including the shedding of innocent blood. For he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord was not willing to forgive. As for the other events of Jehoiakim's reign and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Jehoiakim rested, and his fathers, and Jehoiakim his son succeeded him as king. So back up to verse 4. For he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord was not willing to forgive. Does that mean what we think it means? That God won't forgive your sins? Sometimes that he won't forgive sins you've done?
I think if you willingly, knowingly keep doing whatever you're doing that you shouldn't be doing, I think.
When is 2 Kings written? Is this at a time when we have the blood of Christ to cover our sins? To ask for forgiveness? We don't have that same thing. God does forgive, although sometimes he did not forgive. In this case, when it says not forgive, does it mean that God always is going to hold that against them? Or does it mean that he did not allow them to escape the consequences?
I think that's more it.
I was gonna say,
He
they
did not
didn't
cancel
ask
the
for-
consequences.
They didn't ask for forgiveness.
They didn't ask
And
for
he
it?
was- That's the thing. He didn't go do his little lamb thingy at the end of the year.
And he wasn't
And
looking for it. He
wasn't-
was being arrogant and, I'm gonna do my own thing.
Keep that word arrogant in mind, because that's a real bitter point with God. These men who pull themselves up and act like they are God and act arrogantly, right? So we kind of have to be careful with scriptures like this, because someone who's used to the covenant that we're under now, they think, well, everything's forgiven, which is true. You can be forgiven.
But don't put any gods before God.
But Marta, do you have to be willing to be forgiven?
Yes, yes.
You have to be willing to be forgiven.
Be humble and be
And
willing.
even if I'm forgiven, do I sometimes have to live with the consequences
Yes.
of my
Yes.
sin?
But
In
it's
fact,
everything.
I have found that often when it's a repeated offense, it's like that's one of the things God does, is quit removing the consequences. Like the first time, maybe it doesn't turn out too bad and things kind of work out and I feel forgiven, I feel really sorry about it, and so I do better. But then I do it again later on, right? And it seems to me, you tell me if this is your experience, it seems to me as a Christian that at the first time, it's like God does kind of make a way around it. And I know I'm forgiven either way, but the consequences don't seem to be as bad the first few times. But when I keep repeating it, it's like he will not remove those consequences.
He thinks, it's time to stop. You can't do this anymore.
He's trying to grow me and learn me,
Yes,
isn't he?
yes.
Just like you would a child. And there comes a point at which you say, look, if you're going to learn the lesson, okay, then we'll let things be a little easier for you. But if you're not going to learn the lesson, I had a good friend who said that when she had a problem with drinking and then wild sexual behavior after that from being out of her mind with alcohol. And when she was young, like 16 to her mid-20s, it was really bad. And she picked up some venereal diseases. She came to a saving knowledge of Christ. Everything else in her life squared away really well. But she never recovered from the consequences of the venereal diseases. Mm-hmm. All of the rest of her life, as a godly woman, through the rest of her life, she struggled with some of the things that she had picked up during that time. And she felt that was a reminder to her of how serious that sin was, because at the time she thought of it as nothing. Even though God called it a sin, she didn't think it was that big a deal. And she felt that this is her report, she felt like as she went later in her adult life, she continued to kind of feel that way, like people don't need to make such a big deal out of that. And she feels that that's why God allowed that consequence to stay, because she knows he has the power to heal her and could have healed her.
Yes.
But he knows that she needed that reminder that this is a serious kind of sin, not something that you should take lightly. So that was her testimony.
But when you pick your favorite sin, your
Yes.
sin of choice,
Yes?
and you justify it over and over,
Yes.
Your mind starts thinking that way.
Yes, it does.
Say if it was stealing.
Yes.
Well, you would enter a room and the people you meet, and you'd see what they had.
Yeah.
So that you could try to figure out how to get it in the trunk of your car.
Yes.
And that's the way you would think, because your mind is crooked, it's twisted. That's why they call them crooks, probably.
Yes, I really believe that we could probably, I think it's not unlikely that all of us could share certain things that have been a struggle for us individually, that we feel like the consequences don't really go away for us, because we're still learning it, we're still believing it.
Mommy, I mean Grandma.
What?
I'm hungry.
You are? Okay. In your bag is a baggie of Cheerios. One of your backpacks has a baggie of Cheerios. Okay, so in 2 Kings 24, 1 through 5 then, go back now to Ezekiel 24, and we're going to read Ezekiel 24, 1 through 5. So Ezekiel, remember, is written, and then in Kings we see it happen. So Ezekiel 24, 1 through 5. In the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th day, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, record this date, this very date, because the king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem this very day. Well, that's not a prophecy. Wouldn't he have known that? Where is Ezekiel? He was taken captive in Babylon. He's in captivity. Would he know the day, on the day that the place was attacked, that Jerusalem was attacked, would he know that? No, they don't have text messaging. They don't have news media. There's no TV, right? You wouldn't know if you were all the way in Babylonia that Jerusalem had been attacked that day. So that's why they're making this point, because it was remarkable that on that day, Ezekiel received and gave this message. Later on, they're going to hear, oh, guess what? Jerusalem was attacked. Tell this, what kind of house?
Rebellious.
Isn't arrogance and rebelliousness and pride just kind of all woven in together? It's all kind of the same thing, isn't it? This rebellious house, a parable, and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Put on the cooking pot, put on and pour water into it, put into it the pieces of meat, all the choice pieces, the leg and the shoulder, fill it with the best of these bones, take the pick of the flock, pile wood beneath it for the bones, bring it to a boil, and cook the bones in it. What is he saying? He's saying he is making some stew, and you people are the meat. That's what he's saying. And he's going to cook them down. He's going to cook down that arrogance and rebellion. And they are the meat being thrown into the cooking pot. Skip on down to verse 14, 24, verse 14. I, the Lord, have spoken. The time has come for me to act. I will not hold back. I will not have pity, nor will I relent. You will be judged according to your conduct and your actions, declares the sovereign Lord. Those are not words we want to hear from God, huh? No. Skip on down to verse 17. Groan quietly, do not mourn for the dead. Keep your turban fastened and your sandals on your feet. Do not cover the lower part of your face or eat the customary food of mourners. Now, in verse 15, Ezekiel's wife dies. And I'm sorry, let me start. In Ezekiel 24, I'll start at 15. Says, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, with one blow I am about to take away from you to the delight of your eyes. Now remember, Ezekiel was being an example of what was happening to the people. He was doing street theater. Yet do not lament or weep or shed any tears. Groan quietly, do not mourn the dead. In other words, Ezekiel's wife, who he loved, died. And God said, don't mourn. Don't shed any tears. What's he supposed to do? Groan quietly. Keep your turban fastened. Keep yourself together and groan, mourn quietly. Ezekiel is demonstrating to the people how God feels. God gets no pleasure out of putting Jerusalem in that cooking pot. There's no pleasure in seeing them suffer from the punishments. He's doing it because that's what needs to happen for them. He's not happy about it. He's not having fun. And he's making it clear here that this is not fun for him. Ezekiel's job is to show them how God is feeling. Ezekiel's wife dies. And Ezekiel's told don't mourn. You can groan inwardly. Because that's how God feels about what's happening with Jerusalem. You might say from these angry words that happened earlier, oh, God's liking this. He's feeling all powerful. God doesn't need to feel all powerful.
Yes.
He is all powerful. He's just sad. He's inwardly groaning because of this tragedy that happened to his people. Remember that he calls them his people. This is not a happy day for him. So if you go on down to verse 21, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am about to desecrate my sanctuary. What? Wouldn't that just be heartbreaking for God, on God's part? I'm about to desecrate my own sanctuary. The stronghold in which you take pride, the delight of your eyes, the object of your affection. In other words, they loved the sanctuary more than they loved God himself. The sons and daughters you left behind will fall by the sword. I know, that's what I said too. I just shook my head. For chapter 25. We start here now with the prophecies against these different countries. These are all countries that surround Jerusalem and that area, and the land of Canaan, basically. And God's going to go one after the other and pronounce judgment on them. Now, he just said that they were his tools, that they were his sword. So he's going to use them to do, he's going to allow things to happen that he might not have allowed before because of the evilness of these other nations. But they're going to have consequences for it. It's not going to just be over.
Grandma,
Yes, Alan.
tonight
Chapter
the
25.
wiping, my hands are sticky from those cereals and they're honey flavored.
Honey flavoring Cheerios leave your hands sticky.
Yes, they do.
Okay, go on. Go back over. Okay, chapter 25 says, you'll be okay. We'll get it later. Chapter 25, the oracles against the nations. So look at the sin of Ammon. It's right there in, it says, the word of the Lord came to me, son of man, set your face against the Ammonites and prophesy against them. Say to them, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because you said, aha. That's what it says right there. Look. Aha. Over my sanctuary when it was desecrated. So what offended God about the Ammonites?
They said, aha.
They were glad to see Jerusalem destroyed. They were laughing at it. They were, aha, now your precious city. He says, and over the land of Israel when it was laid waste, and over the people of Judah when they went into exile. Therefore, I'm going to give to you the people of the east as a possession. They will set up their camps and pitch their tents among you. Let's see how you like it when they come into your land, Ammonites. Verse 6.
Is there a trash can anywhere?
I'll take it. For this is what the Lord says, because you have clapped your hands and stamped your feet, rejoicing with all the malice of your heart against the land of Israel. Therefore I will stretch out my hand against you and give you as plunder to the nations. So there was the judgment against the Ammonites. Down in the end of, I will cut you from the nations and exterminate you from the countries. I will destroy you, and you will know that I am the Lord, because Moab and Seir said, look, the house of Judah has become like all the other nations. They aren't so special anymore. Look, they're just like everybody else. That was offensive to God. And then the end of chapter verse 11, then they will know that I am the Lord. Now, Ammon is east of Jordan. It was down here in the study Bible, if you read it in the study Bible, if you have a study Bible section at the bottom, it says the oracles against the nations, frequently the prophets. God's word of judgment on Israel is accompanied by oracles of judgment on the nations. These make clear that while judgment begins with the family of God, the pagan nations would not escape God's wrath. Often these judgments are implicit messages of salvation for Israel, since the Lord's victories over hostile powers remove an enemy of his people or punish them for their cruel attacks on his people. In the case of Ezekiel, there are 7 oracles, the 7th of which has 7 parts, each introduced by the phrase, "The word of the Lord came to me." The structure of these oracles follows the pattern because, therefore, and then the judgment. And then at the end, it's all know that I am the Lord. So it has the same pattern in each of the oracles that's given. So we see that pattern here that shows what they did wrong, God's judgment on that, and in the end, then they will know that I am the Lord. So he's demonstrating his power. So if he has to prove to them he's Lord, then what's the problem? Someone else is Lord. Who? They made up gods. They themselves were kind of cocky, right? So God's going to make sure they know who's really Lord, who's really in charge. Take a look at the Edomites in verse 12. This is what the sovereign Lord says: because Edom took revenge on the house of Judah and became very guilty by doing so. Connie, you want to describe that? Do you remember when they took revenge on Judah?
The Edomites.
Mm-hmm.
That's with Jacob and Esau, and they've been fighting ever since.
Ever since, yeah. And so Isaac had sons, Jacob and Esau, right? Jacob had the 12 sons with 12 tribes, and Judah was one of those tribes. And from Judah's tribe came David and then Jesus. That's King David and Jesus. On the other side of Esau, the red one, red hairy one, his descendants would be the Edomites. In 586 BC, after Jerusalem was taken into siege, there was the 2-year siege, and then when it fell, the Edomites waited at the gate and plundered the city after Jerusalem fell. So they were taking advantage of the situation.
In my classroom now.
Okay, in just a few minutes.
Can I take him out to swing?
Oh yeah, it's okay. He can wait a little bit. He'll get all sweaty and hot and tired and probably break his stitches open. His stitches on his head. Anyway, okay. Yeah, when we went home after VBS, I guess Heather was getting him ready for bed, and somehow she bonked his head on the edge of the bed, the wood. So.
And I gave my mommy a hug and said that she was helping me back up. And she was laughing at me when I gave my hand on her and I just touched my head on one more.
Oh, so it was a big deal. And the doctor gave him a shot too. That was the big thing.
Well, I did a doctor shot. He just poked a needle in my head as a needle that sews your head back up.
Okay, yeah, the needle that sews your head back up. Okay. Okay, so that is then the Edomites. They're getting what they deserve. And then we have Philistia in verse 15, starting in verse 15. And then in chapter 26, we begin Tyre. And Tyre is an important one. Tyre represents in chapter 26 vision number 5. And if you look at Tyre, you will see that Tyre is several chapters here. If you look forward, 26, 27, all the way through 28 is about Tyre. And look at in the very first verses of chapter 26, in the 11th year, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me. So that's vision number 5. Son of man, because Tyre has said of Jerusalem, aha, the gate to the nations is broken, and its doors are swung open to me. Now that she lies in ruins, I will prosper. So that is the cause of their judgment. So Tyre was an important deep water port. It was right off of the actual city of Tyre was on kind of like an island. And when Alexander the Great came through and he was trying to conquer everywhere, trying to conquer the world, Tyre was a real problem because Alexander the Great didn't care for boats too much. And Tyre's kind of up here in this, up in this area. And what happened is they had like a city that was on the land, but the palace and the main part of the city, the government part, was off the land on this small little island place. And so they really thought they were all that and a bag of chips because they had deep water ports there, so they got all the shipments came in from there and would go down, be delivered out. So a great commercial center. And they felt safe because they weren't really part of the land. And Alexander the Great, when he was conquering everything way later, he couldn't get to the actual center of the city because it was on the island, and he wasn't into boats. Alexander the Great did not like the whole boat thing. So he had, though, lots of men. So he had each of his men pick up a boulder and go drop it in the pathway between the land and the island. They did that several times, and they walked over to Tyre and conquered it. And they destroyed Tyre at that time, and it was nothing. They took it they just turned it into rubble. And that was just astounding to everyone historically, because it was such an important commercial city. No one could imagine that city would be destroyed. But Alexander the Great, he didn't want to have to cross that water again. And that's what he did. So Tyre was in a great position to negotiate with Babylon, because Babylon's over on the other side, right? And they're getting all this power. So Tyre's going, oh, goody, let's get Jerusalem out of the way. Then all that commerce and everything will be coming to us. We'll be buddies with Babylon, and we'll just make it all happen. So make sure I get this right. So in 571 BC, Nebuchadnezzar takes the mainland. And so Tyre was thinking they would be fine, right? But Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, when he took Jerusalem in that area, he also came over and took Tyre, but not the island. The island was safe. The island didn't get taken until 332 BC when Alexander the Great did it. And since that time, it has never been rebuilt into a major port. It's just been a small fishing kind of community. And so take a look in chapter 26, go on down to verse 7. This is what the sovereign Lord says. From the north, I am going to bring who? Tyre, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, with horses and chariots, with horsemen and a great army. He will ravage your settlements on the mainland with the sword. He will set up siege works against you and build a ramp up to your walls and raise his shields against you. And he goes on to describe the destruction of the city of Tyre, which is exactly what happened in 571 BC. Go down to verse 14. I will make you a bare rock, and you will become a place to spread fish nets. You will never be rebuilt, for I, the Lord, have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to Tyre. Will not the coastlands tremble at the sound of your fall, when the wounded groan and the slaughter takes place in you? Then all the princes of the coast will step down from their thrones and lay aside their robes and take off their embroidered garments. Clothed with terror, they will sit on the ground, trembling, every moment appalled at you. Then they will take up a lament concerning you, and it goes on. So it's going to be a sad day, and that does happen in 332 BC with Alexander the Great, and that never was rebuilt. It never returned to their former glory. And of course, at the end of this section here, verse 21, you will be sought, but you will never again be found, declares the sovereign Lord. Then in chapter 27, it says, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, take a look concerning Tyre. Say to Tyre, situated at the gateway to the sea, merchant of the peoples on my coastlands, this is what the sovereign Lord says. And then it goes on and talks about how beautiful Tyre is and how he's going to destroy it. Go on to the end of chapter 27, verse 36. The merchants among the nations hiss at you. You have come to a horrible end and will be no more. And now, chapter 28, what does your Bible say the title of chapter 28 is?
It says, Tyre's king overthrown.
Okay, so now we're talking about the king. Were we talking about the king in those other two chapters, 26 and 27? Was that about the king?
City.
There was the city and the people of the city, right? So now God is turning his attention to the king. And this is where we have a tie into Revelation. Kind of interesting. Chapter 28. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, say to the ruler of Tyre, this is what the sovereign Lord says. In the pride of your heart, you say, I am a god. I sit on the throne of a god in the heart of the seas. But you are a man and not a god. Though you think you are as wise as a god, are you wiser than Daniel? Is no secret hidden from you? In other words, even now, Daniel is a contemporary of Ezekiel, right? And he's considered noble and able to reveal prophecies and stuff. By your wisdom and understanding, you have gained wealth for yourself and amassed gold and silver in your treasures. By your great skill in trading, you have increased your wealth, and because of your wealth, your heart has grown proud. What was wrong with the king of Tyre?
Very wealthy.
That was what was wrong, that he was wealthy?
No, he
He
thought
was all about himself.
I thought he was God.
Yeah, I'm glad we're not like that.
Yeah. No, none of us walk on water. We're just
Oh.
people.
I know, but it's sad to say that I'm afraid that so many times we push ourselves up, don't we? Like we're deciding, and we
I can
actually.
run my life.
God doesn't really mean that, does he? Yeah. Because you think you are wise as a God, I am going to bring foreigners against you, the most ruthless of nations. They will draw their swords against your beauty and wisdom and pierce your shining splendor. They will bring you down to the pit, and you will die a violent death in the heart of the seas. Will you then say, I am a God, in the presence of those who kill you? You will be but a man, not a God, in the hands of those who slay you. You will die the death of the uncircumcised at the hands of foreigners. I have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man. Take up a lament concerning the king of Tyre and say to him, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Okay, get ready. You are the model of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned you. Ruby, topaz, and emerald, chrysolite, onyx, jasper, sapphire, turquoise, and beryl. Your settings and mountings were made of gold. On the day you were created, they were prepared. You were anointed as a garden cherub, so I ordained you. You were in the holy mount of God. You walked among the fiery stones. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till wickedness was found in you. Through your widespread trade, you were filled with violence, and you sinned. So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God, and I expelled you, O guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to the earth. I made a spectacle of you before kings. By your many sins and dishonest trade, you have desecrated your sanctuaries. So I made a fire come out from you, and I consumed you. And I reduced you to ashes on the ground in the sight of all who are watching. All the nations who knew you are appalled at you. You have come to a horrible end and will be no more. Now, what do you right away think of? When I read that, I started, wait, where else have I, that's here?
Yep.
He's talking about the king of Tyre? And then what about, you were in Eden, the garden of God? Tyre wasn't, what? That's confusing, isn't it? We referred to this when we did Revelation chapter 12. So look at Revelation chapter 12. I actually thought this passage was in Revelation, but no, when we studied Revelation chapter 12, starting at verse 7, this was a passage that we went back and referred to. Remember in chapter 12, it was the vision of the stars that aligned and the planets that aligned, the astronomical event that we called the woman and the dragon. And we looked at the pictures of the planets and how they aligned and all that. And look at verse 7. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Oh, now look back at that Ezekiel passage. That's kind of odd there, right? Now take a look at, I'm keeping all three in place. I'm going to keep my third finger on Luke 10. Luke 10, starting at verse 17. The 72 returned with joy and said, Lord, even the demons, this is when they went out, he sent them all out to minister, and they came back, and they were all excited. They said, even the demons submit to us in your name. They were like all surprised. Wow, even the demons. And then verse 18, he replied, I saw Satan. This is red. This is in red words. I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. I have given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and to overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing will harm you. However, do not rejoice that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. Ooh, isn't that weird? Do you mean that there's potentially some event that happened, some astrological event that happened with God before Adam and Eve that we don't quite know all about? How could that be? You mean there was something before Genesis? What was there before Genesis? God.
It says, when it says replenish, there had to be something before, because he would have said not replenish.
Right, that's the wrong word for something, yeah. So this is a peep, we're getting a little peephole into events that occurred even before the creation happened. Some say that this event, if you remember when we talked about it, many scholars believe this happened between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. That this event with Satan occurred in that time period. Because by the time we see Adam and Eve in the garden, where do we see Satan? As a serpent trying to deceive, right? From the beginning of time that we know of, we see the serpent as a deceiver. But we saw in Job, we saw in Ezekiel, we saw in Luke, we see in Revelation this glimpse of some events that occurred before we came on the scene.
Now, this program didn't start with us.
No. However, there is something that keeps being used about this event throughout Scripture as an example. Notice here in Ezekiel, it says, you were the model of perfection, full of wisdom, perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. This is saying, you remind me of someone I know. So what is the king of Tyre? You remind me of someone I know. Who is he being reminded of? Satan himself. And what was it about the king of Tyre that made God so angry?
Because he thought he was all that in a bag of
Pride.
He thought he was God.
Who else was pride? When we did Daniel, who else was full of pride? Nebuchadnezzar. And he got humble for a little while, and then one day he's walking around going, I really am great. I really am all that. Then he goes out and starts eating the grass and turns to right? What is it that gets God's goat, so to speak, more than anything else?
When we think we're better than God, that we can do anything on our own.
God provides forgiveness for us. He helps make our way. We live by faith in his power, and then we start owning it. We start saying, oh, I'm this way because I'm just so smart.
And then we get out on a limb and we think we don't need God anymore. We can just handle it all on our own.
Pride is a dangerous thing, isn't it? It is so dangerous that a heavenly being that actually was with God in heaven, was deceived by his own pride and became Satan. And throughout Scripture, we see this tie. We see here with the king of Tyre, we saw with Nebuchadnezzar, we see all these examples of those who were prideful. The children of Israel took great pride in their temple and began deciding what should happen in there, adding other little gods just because they thought that would be the best way to do it, right? That's a form of pride. We're doing what we think is right, not what God says is right. So this whole passage right here on Satan, this is about Satan, but it's about the king of Tyre and all those who get consumed with pride. That's what that's about. And the fall that occurs. It ties into that Revelation passage, into the Luke passage. It also ties into us. Because how do we go about being confident in our life without being prideful? How do we...
Balancing is
And we're growing like a good teacher. God is the best of teachers. So Joan and I know that when you're teaching a student, you want them to become independent. So as they become independent and they're able to do things kind of on their own, we're assisting them less and less, and we're working with them on the next thing they need to learn, right? So they're getting proficient with one skill, and we're bringing back up the next skill. We want the child to feel confident. We want them to do what they can do, right? But how do we keep the child from being so cocky that they won't even listen to their own teacher? How does God get us to become proficient with what he has for us to learn, and yet continue to be humble enough to learn what's next?
Sometimes he takes us down in order to
I was
make
gonna
us
say,
see. He gives us what we need.
yeah, you get something out, but it's still like.
But I think for me, the best way that I know is just remember God's in control. God's one that made this happen, and give him the glory and honor when he allows me to do these things, and it's not by my might, it's by his. And if I constantly, pray and remember, God gave that to me, God did this, God did that. It's difficult, it's very hard, but you have to go every day, every minute, and remind yourself, God's in control.
Is it
God
okay
did
to
that.
say, I'm doing pretty good on that? Oh, good, God, it looks like I did pretty good on that one. Okay, I'm going to try to do it good again. Is that okay?
Right.
Is proficiency or mastery or, the point is, though, do we always remember who our teacher is and that we have another thing? So have you ever seen Alan write his name? When he makes the letter A, it takes much concentration, a lot of effort. He's got to get the pencil just right, and it's a struggle, right? It's difficult. But pretty soon we know, within a year, he's going to easily write his whole name, right? It won't be such a struggle. And then he'll be on to the next skill. There's always the next struggle. Did Christ have a struggle?
Yes.
He knew he was going to the cross. Even when he was tempted by Satan, what was he tempted to do?
Bow down and worship him, get some angels to come.
Yeah,
eat
yeah,
the bread,
yeah.
turn it into stone.
Anything. Just so that he was doing what Satan was asking to be done. That was the whole point, right? And Jesus did not. He kept his course. God will always give us what we need to finish the course. I read this really interesting article by Greg Laurie, and he says, this reminds us that the devil often hits us as Christians in the beginning of our spiritual lives, challenging us to doubt our salvation. But he also wants to trip us up at the end of our journey so that he can discredit all the good things we did. That's why the Apostle Paul said he wanted to finish the race with joy. This is a journey we're on with God, and we are becoming increasingly proficient with some skills. That doesn't mean we're there. That just means we're on this path with God, and that piece we're doing pretty good on. Vern?
Well, my son and I keep reminding each other that yesterday's prayers were for yesterday, and today is a different day, and we need to get right and humble and connect to the source
Every
today,
day.
now.
And
It's
we
a
are
now thing.
we are in process.
Yes.
We are not going to get there. We're not going to get to a
No.
place. We are in process. God is growing us and teaching us and learning us. And we will master some things, and they'll become pretty automatic to us, and that's great. But there's going to be the next thing that we need to learn all along the way. Yes, always the next thing to learn. So that's where we are. This King of Tyre is about pride. Jerusalem's problem was pride. Satan's problem was pride.
My problem.
Sorry to say, it's all of us. We really have difficulty. Even a person who you say has low self-esteem, they have a pride issue. Right? It's the same thing. It's just the flip-flop of it.
Yeah. And then you look at our leaders today too.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my.
Well, I had such a hard time in the last election because I just didn't like the boastful manner of one of them. I liked the policies of one, but I didn't like the boastful manner. That was so objectionable to me. But I just couldn't stomach the other one either. So it's hard. It's very difficult. And then I've been involved in this with the state legislators, and I can see how it gets to be that way. You're playing all these games to try to get what you want done. Pretty soon you lose track of what you're doing, and you're just playing the games. So it's really hard.
Two wings of the same bird.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard.
And that's, yeah.
It's hard when you see people exhibiting those kind of affects that we know are not good or healthy for leadership and learning. Anyway, this was about pride. So next time we will not meet next Sunday, but the following Sunday we'll be back on target. So remember that, everyone. We won't be meeting next Sunday, but we will start then the following. I am